All right, thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to try to cover some things kind of on a broad brush here about recreation and wildlife together. I learned a lot actually doing this, so that's good. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background to give this presentation. I've worked for a long time in research for the P&W Research Station, but I actually have a background in management for both Region 6 and the BLM in Oregon. And I guess the point is that recreation sort of followed me around during my career, whether I wanted it to or not. When I was dealing with wildlife issues, I had a lot of frequent interaction with recreation stakeholders. The first one was in 1982 with the BLM as a GS5 wildlife biologist, and we had a proposed set of road closures to, quote, mitigate timber harvest plan. And houndsmen who hunted bears and cougars at those times got quite upset by all the proposed road closures, and that was my first interaction with stakeholders. And the first stakeholder meeting with them, they brought a TV crew from Portland, and we had a district manager who was pretty risk averse and didn't want to talk, and so they laid it all on me. I was like, why are we doing this? Closing down all these opportunities for recreation. So that was fun. Since then, I've had more fun with recreation and wildlife issues. It's always a challenge, and it's always a learning opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about effects on wildlife from recreation, a little bit about evaluating effects, trade-offs, and opportunities, a little bit about research and management needs, and some challenges and strategies. And there will be other scientists who talk later today about specific effects on specific wildlife species. You've seen these lists. They're very long lists of common recreational activities. It's quite daunting for both recreation and wildlife specialists and managers to deal with. And of course, some more recent activities that are growing. So fun never ends. Lots of people out there who like to recreate, including myself. What are the effects on wildlife? Well, there was a really nice meta-analysis and publication by Larson et al. And PLOS One about a year ago. The effects are quite diverse, given all the different kinds of recreation. They're largely negative. The large majority of these effects on wildlife are negative, both for motorized and non-motorized. And this was an interesting result, as they actually stated in the paper that non-motorized recreation effects were stronger than motorized. But if you look at the analysis, they're roughly equally negative. And many of these effects are not obvious. They're often very insidious. There are direct and indirect effects. All types of vertebrate attacks are affected, but oftentimes species of conservation concern or hunted species are most affected. It makes sense that if it's a species of conservation concern, they may be sensitive to human presence in the form of a lot of different kinds of recreation. We have a bias when we do ecological research in these topics. We like large-bodied vertebrates like grizzly bears, elk, whatever. So our knowledge is better than, say, for amphibians or reptiles. But the effects that we have researched they're often cumulative, they're chronic, and therefore very long-lasting. This is a big one. There has been research on this and a lot of surveys of recreationists. And what's interesting about it is social awareness of negative effects of recreation is quite low. Often people say that whatever they do out for recreation, whether they're consumptive or non-consumptive, is benign. And I think this is my personal view, sort of my experience with some of this, is that has resulted in some strong resistance by different types of recreationists to implementation of any kinds of integrated recreation wildlife planning. We've been told by some groups who supported our research when it began, and then the results came out, didn't like it so much that it turned out to be junk science. So there are those same groups that love some of the other results from other kinds of research we do beyond recreation. So there is this idea, I think, out there, and I'm not trying to pick on horseback riders or mountain bikers. There's a broad sort of view from many different types of recreationists that their participation out in the outdoors is benign in terms of effects on wildlife. The knowledge is substantial, but there are large gaps that remain. There was talk about multi-millions and even billions of dollars from recreation in terms of federal public land use. One of the challenges is that BLM Forest Service don't really get those funds to manage recreation, and I think that really shows in the lack of monitoring and research given the economic effects of recreation. Then when we talk about effects on wildlife, there's a very long list of effects, and we oftentimes don't really consider many of these in management simply because it's quite difficult to do, if not impossible in some cases. But It runs the gamut here. I just want to list them all just to make the point that there are many types of effects of recreation on wildlife that are difficult to measure and they're not obvious, and in particular among public groups who believe that their effects are benign. If you look at the bottom here, it all comes down to all these things playing out in terms of species fitness, the capability to survive, reproduce, and maintain population growth to exist. There are three categories that scientists often think about when they measure effects of recreation on wildlife, and it's behavioral, physiological, and energetic. There are other ways to categorize these things, but we tend to think more about behavioral effects, things like avoidance, landscape shifts, and distribution by wildlife in response to presence of recreationists. But there are other insidious things like physiological responses, especially immune function and susceptibility to diseases that actually come along with increased stress. It really amounts to energetic balance for a lot of wildlife species in the presence of recreationists. Loss of body fat, increased movement rates, less foraging, can reduce population fitness and growth and result in functional extirpation from landscapes or even larger areas. And I think this is an important point. The mere presence of humans in some cases, not all, and I don't mean to pick on spelunkers or cave recreation uses, it can elicit negative behavioral, physiological, and energetic responses by wildlife. I think an important point here is that it's very hard to research these effects. A variety of sensory cues are being used by wildlife, some of which we can't relate to. These cues are very difficult to identify and evaluate. And the effects of human presence are magnified oftentimes by the accompanying presence of our friends, our animal friends, our mechanized uses. The example here is simply, an unleashed dog walking along the ocean beach with their owner, and the effects on shorebird nesting or migratory seasons. And some of the migratory effects on shorebirds have been quite strong for this kind of effect. So how do we evaluate these sorts of things in management? This is a real tough go. NEPA requirements require pretty substantial effects analysis for a lot of different recreation activities and a lot of different wildlife species. We want to think about evaluation in sort of two different types. One is linear use. These are recreation paths that recreationists use, and then points of use. These would be specific places, concentrations of recreation use where you have a specific wildlife use that overlaps. These sorts of effects analyses were actually in a GTR put out by the Forest Service, National Forest System, about monitoring human disturbances. It's called the Technical Guide for Monitoring Wildlife Habitat. It is available in tree search on the web, so it might be a nice reference for people to look at if they haven't. In terms of evaluating linear-based effects, you're looking at evaluation of wildlife responses to any kind of linear route out there used by recreationists. So that includes roads, motorized trails, non-motorized trails, natural linear paths. And down in red, I just want to point this out that oftentimes a dominant use of our public lands, BLM and Forest Service, now is by recreationists. It used to be by timber folks or whatever, or a lot of other uses, but we've got this trend now for our roads being relied on as either recreation routes or places to get to recreation sites. So they're being valued by our recreationists, and there are some big effects from those increasing frequency of uses of our public roads on BLM Forest Service lands. We often evaluate these effects on the wildlife side called distance band analysis, and if you look at these areas of green, these are roads open to public motorized use, and these are quarter-mile distance bands, and so a lot of these effects play out in terms of distance from a motorized route in this case. And the area in green is the area over 1 mile from a road, and that in this case it would be considered no effect. The closer you are to a road, the greater the shift or the avoidance response. And this has been used a lot. I think it's a very useful kind of analysis for a given kind of road effect on a species of wildlife. There are these point-based effects, though, too. These are concentrated areas where you might have a recreation site overlapping specific use sites. And these are just some examples of the kinds of concentrations of wildlife that are quite important to their survival. And so then you have the overlapping points, either the wildlife use or the recreation uses are both together. And these things, I think, play out in some ways where the effects can be quite strong because they're concentrated. You have a lot of people showing up in a specific area for a specific recreation use, and you have concentrated use by different wildlife species that in some sort of part of their life cycle they would depend on not being disturbed, and that becomes an issue. Oh, I wanted to mention too, this can go both ways. I think there'll be a talk about campgrounds. In this case, it's actually helping the corvid population, but then there are ramifications for corvid predation on other wildlife that are quite negative. How do we evaluate these point-based effects? If these were campgrounds, for example, and we had nest sites of a rare bird, we would look at that site and evaluate the effects, but we also can use these distance band approaches in case you have some radiating effect away that's decreasing as you get away from, say, a campground. These point-based effects, like I mentioned, can be much more stronger than the linear-based effects. Cumulative effects. This is a real challenge. On the right is the map that I showed, or actually I should say, on the left is the map that I showed for the roads open to motorized traffic. Those are the green roads here. And in this case, there are proposed ATV routes to key off of the road system shown here in these brown areas. And so the idea here is that if we were simply to evaluate the proposed ATV routes and we did a distance band analysis, you would have a much smaller area that you would say would be affected by that. But in fact, the cumulative effects, which are shown here on the right, when you look at the ATV routes combined with the roads, shows a much larger area that's affected. And we have done research on some wildlife that does show that ATV use is very similar to general motorized use on roads. So in this case, we go from about the green area on the left being a little less than 40% of the area not affected, to less than 20% being affected when you think about cumulative effects. And I think these are important points to consider when we think about new proposals in the context of a landscape full of a lot of recreation activities. And you can go further than this. You can add some of the point-based recreation sites onto these kinds of maps. You know, there's many factors that go together here. You can add mitigations. On the right is mitigation for steep slopes where the effects on wildlife may not be as great because people don't travel as much on steep slopes, those kinds of things. And so it amounts to some things that I think we struggle with on the management side and we struggle with on the research side to research, and that is how do you aggregate all of these different recreational activities, linear and point-based, together when you're considering recreation management and NEPA work. And so in this case it's roads plus ATV routes plus consideration of key nest sites near campgrounds, for example, and maybe mitigation for slope to get this cumulative map of either avoidance or use, depending on how you express it. The map on the right is basically the area of low effect is up here. This is high effect here, and these are intermediate effects. And this represents sum of ranks where we took individual maps and we summed them from high to moderate to low effects, and then summed those uses and got this aggregate. There are many different ways to do this kind of analysis. This is just one example. These can be represented in formal modeling approaches like resource selection functions and occupancy models that are starting being used in management. The difficulty in cumulative effects analysis with multiple recreation factors to be considered on wildlife is you don't know what those interactions, those factors are, be additive, multiplicative, limiting, overriding, you name it. Additive effects generally are a good way to go. I wanted to point out that you end up with a lot of these different generic sort of rule sets when you start overlaying all these different recreation factors on responses for wildlife. And these things actually can be modeled in quantitative modeling approaches, even if you are simply using categorical variables like high, moderate, low use or high, moderate, low effects. So there are ways, I think, for evaluating this that can be improved. In this case here, trade-offs and opportunities. On the left is a human ecology map that we generalized a little bit from Lee Cervini, who's a social scientist at the PNW Research Station. She's done a lot of really great surveys of recreationists on national forests in Oregon and Washington, and she's asked them a lot of really great questions about how they value different places, and it's all been mapped in a spatially explicit way, and we basically did that, a composite of that. These areas are high recreation values, moderate, and then the light color is low. And then we have done some work on elk nutrition maps for the same area. We've done it for Western Oregon, and in this case, the same area, high is shown here in the dark green, then the moderate green, and the light green is low. And so we thought, well, heck, this is the kind of thing that would be interesting to overlay, to look at trade-offs and opportunities between what you value for recreation and what is valuable for a resource for a wildlife species. So a simple overlay, we don't show all the different combinations, but I think it does show some opportunities. What we chose to map is areas that were of high recreation but low nutrition, shown in green. Then on this lighter color is low recreation but moderate high nutrition, and then high recreation values and moderate high nutrition. And the punchline here is, if this was an example that you actually want to use in management, it starts to portray the landscape in ways where you see opportunities or compatibility that exist already and places that you want to focus on to try to help resolve potential competing objectives. The areas that are high recreation in green, dark green, and low nutrition, hey, no problem. If you have low recreation, these light areas here, and moderate high nutrition, no problem. It's these areas that are kind of the salmon colored, that are high recreation and moderate high nutrition, that managers probably want to work with stakeholders on to try to address. Or maybe it doesn't matter if you've got enough nutrition out there that's moderate and high away from the high recreational values. So I think these are the kinds of things that would be important for us to consider as we move forward for integration of recreation and wildlife planning. And in that, I think the social scientists have a big role to play. They haven't been involved. They're really starting to become involved. And I think we really need to engage stakeholders by design. That includes recreation and wildlife advocates working in the same room, the same places, as well as hopefully engaging some other folks who probably have some opinions about these things but don't usually get involved. On the social science, the research needs, there's been some great surveys done by people like Lee Cervini and others to understand these stakeholders, but also all the other folks who are engaged in these issues, to document perceptions, attitudes, desires, and in particular their willingness to consider different approaches for recreation, wildlife research, and management. The human ecology maps that are being developed, these are developed by the recreation users. I think that includes wildlife advocates. I think that's really a nice way, and you saw the one map that Lee produced, to be able to talk in a very spatially explicit way with a lot of different recreation users about what matters and why and where. These are the kinds of formal questions that are developed, and then people actually place their votes on maps for why they value certain places for different kinds of recreational uses. On the wildlife side, obviously we've got some needs. There's been some good work done, but a lot more wildlife taxa, especially amphibians, reptiles, for example, are understudied. We need better studies, controlled landscape studies, and replication. There's been not a lot of focus on fitness responses of wildlife to recreation, and it's very tough to do, but there are some simulation modeling approaches that could be done to try to address fitness. We need to look at cumulative effects, and I think placing recreation effects in the context of all factors that affect wildlife is quite important. We have done some of this modeling through resource selection functions. That's important too. Sometimes recreation matters very little, but it has an effect. Sometimes it may be the number one factor. Just wanted to point out that there are ways that people have done trade-off analyses. This one was to look at ecosystem services in relation to biodiversity, for example, and a variety of other resources. And the punchline here is that it doesn't give you a definitive answer, but what it tells you, it narrows down the issues to what's possible and not possible, what's likely and not likely, and it also elicits some obvious opportunities. Things don't always have to be trade-offs. There are some obvious win-wins where you overlay on all these different competing objectives and find out where there's commonality and and room for going forth with management or other places where you need to really focus on maybe some intractable issues. There's something called socio-ecological systems research now, where social scientists and ecologists get together and actually work with stakeholders and managers from the very start and do integrated research. I think that's important to consider. And just in closing, some challenges. Obviously, we all know these issues are going to be a great challenge as we move forward. The diversity of recreationists, the diversity of effects are going to be very tough to deal with, especially with recreational demands growing, and we have limited areas in terms of and limited staffing. Compromise and trade-offs obviously are going to be tough sometimes to deal with. I think we need some new socio-ecological approaches to identify these trade-offs and facilitate some thinking and dialogue with all of the different recreation users. And the strategic approaches, obviously we all talk about this, but in fact recreation is growing so quickly, and some of the potential conflicts with resources like wildlife is growing so quickly that we tend to be reactive. We tend to be reacting mostly right now on public lands that are near a lot of the urban areas where these things are playing out. I guess one of the things that I find interesting, being from Eastern Oregon and looking at what the forest collaborators are doing there, they're mostly focused on vegetation management. We have a lot of traditional recreation uses. Those are sort of taken for granted, but there are conflicts. But we have this wave of increasing recreation coming from the urban areas and finding their way to the more remote national forests. But I think in our case, in terms of the remote areas, we have some opportunities to be strategic right now with our stakeholders to really identify ways of balancing recreation use with wildlife needs. Just want to mention that there's a number of us in the PNW Research Station who are involved in recreation research. We're starting to work with the social scientists. Again, if you have any questions or want to contact us about anything, we're glad to interact with folks. And with that, if there's any time, be glad to answer any questions. If not, we can talk later. Thank you. Okay.
Questions for Mike? We've got time. Just repeat the question, please.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'll
Go
go first.
ahead.
Thanks. Do you see any differences at present or anticipate increased difficulty in managing specific types of recreation?
Well, I guess do I see any particular kinds of recreation that might be more difficult to deal with than others? Is that okay? I haven't dealt with any recreation stakeholders who were more difficult than others. I think there's a lot of advocacy that's very strong, and I think one of the issues that, of course, I didn't mention, but is competition among different kinds of recreationists for the same area. I've seen a lot of that conflict on the trails kind of thing. I think that's going to play out too. So it's not just recreationists and wildlife issues, it's recreationists with other recreationists. So I think, yes.
So I'm curious about roads. You talked about roads and thinking about the history of the road system. It was to access active areas before maybe logging. So now these areas, the roads are there, we may not be logging nearly as much, but it's open doors for recreation. To what degree do you believe that the cumulative effects on species are from the longer history of logging disturbance followed by recreation versus are these disturbances and impacts much more recent and solely, in your opinion, on increased recreation? I guess we did start at point zero.
Right. So the question is, there's a legacy of these roads being built for things like livestock grazing or timber production, timber harvest. And now we've got this legacy, and it's being used increasingly by recreationists as recreation routes for recreation or to get to recreation sites. I guess the question is whether there's that legacy effect of the roads and the past uses are stronger or be considered in light of more increasing recreation uses by the public on those roads. Is that? Okay. So I guess the legacy of the past management, I mean, with livestock operators, that lives on. There's a lot of road uses by livestock operators, obviously. But these roads were built for timber harvest or livestock operations, or both, mostly. Those roads are now being used, and so if you look at wildlife responses to road uses, those responses are in terms of things like the frequency of traffic, and then what those people who are driving on those roads actually do. Do they get out and are they hunting, or do they get out and they're mushroom picking or whatever, non-consumptive or consumptive, and how they cover the landscape and the associated uses of the landscape associated with the road use. So I guess I would say that those past activities are still playing out, but much less strongly compared to more recent increases in frequency of road use by recreationists. I think one of the challenges we have here is that we haven't, on public lands mostly, we haven't monitored traffic and traffic rates on a lot of our roads. I think that's an important consideration for a lot of these different wildlife species, because obviously 1 or 2 vehicles in a week makes a big difference compared to maybe hundreds of vehicles on a weekend. And so there are very different effects that play out. So I would say that we're just dealing with a whole different phase of wildlife responses to road uses.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Let me thank Mike, everybody.